open it up in prayer? I appreciate it.
Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your
Amen. And I do pray that God gives me the words to say, not me. That's very important. And thank you for that. Yes. Yes. Let's have a couple more in case somebody else might walk in case we have a visitor. We talked about last week, we ended up just about finishing up how God humbles us, and we brought up some issues. Actually, I'm going to go backwards here. We did not read 1 Timothy 4:15 and 16 last week, and we need to. My wifey, would you please remind me every week in case I forget? I am getting old. Let's read 1 Timothy 4:15 and 16 all together. All right. Meditate upon these things, give thyself wholly to them, that thy profiting may appear to all. Take heed unto thyself and unto the doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. And that is such a powerful, powerful message right there, that others can hear you, they can see you, they see you. There's always eyes upon you. I've always believed that. And some see our good and a lot see our bad. That's what stands out the most, especially if we're Christian. So we left off last week, we almost finished off how God humbles us, but I'm going to run through just some bullet points right quick. Our last session, before that, we talked about the mask of rebellion, and then we said, God has ways of exposing our helplessness as Christians. He can send us a problem that we can't handle, and we talked about Naaman, about his problem that he could not handle, and God, and the end result was Naaman humbled himself before God. He can give us a command we won't obey to expose our self-centeredness, things that we tend to think about ourselves, and we tend not to obey our commands because we're too self-centered. And we talked about how Jonah was a perfect example of that. And it wasn't that, we talked about how everybody knows about Jonah and the whale, but that's really not the gist of that whole story. It's about his self-centeredness, that he did not want to go to Nineveh. And we talked about how we have Ninevites in our own lives that come, and we are exposed to them on a daily basis, and how we tend to refuse to share God's love and share God's word to those Ninevites, the worldly. Not necessarily, we compared the Ninevites last week to the ISIS of today, but really that's not what I was trying to say. We all have the Ninevites in our lives all around us, at work, our neighbors, as we're shopping, all around us. We also brought up he can arrange an outcome we can't control to expose our sinfulness, and we talked about how David was the king. He was highly regarded. The people looked up to him in Israel, and he wrote most of the Psalms, and they sang them in their worship service. And when Bathsheba exposed herself, and David gave in to that, he committed adultery. And not only did he do that, he murdered someone, and he tried to completely keep that under roots, so to say, to keep that from exposing his sinfulness. But God had other plans for that. God exposed that, and David humbled himself as well. So did Jonah, by the way. And then we ended up, no, we talked about Job as well. He could show us a God we cannot comprehend to expose our finiteness. And talking about Job and how Job finally spoke up in chapter 23 of the book of Job about Job wanted his day in court. And then God fires back to Job, well, you think you're so smart. And we went through different things like, Job, do you know where the treasures of the snow are? You think you're so smart? Do you know how to make the sun rise in the morning, Job? You think you're so smart? How about the moon and stars? Do you know? I named them. What are their names, Job? You think you're so smart? So after all that, and then a few other things, Job humbled himself. And what did God do? He blessed him mightily by the humble. And when we have a God, is that powerful, what do we let him do in our life? Our answer should be anything he wants, but most of the time it's not. We try to base it off of our terms. God, I'll do this if, and if. That's a big mistake. God, I'll do this. This week I get to use my wife as an example there. I didn't last week, but Debbie's going to take a job here at the church, and she's been praying about that for a long time. And she's going to do what God wanted her to do this. He laid it in her lap, and tell you what, it's a huge leap of faith. Let's just leave it at that. It's a huge leap of faith. But she's going to follow what God wants her to do, and I am so blessed that I have a wife that will do that. Because, to tell you the truth, I probably would have been a little self-centered and really put up a fight with God. God, I'll do this, but you've got to do this for me. No, she didn't do that. She didn't do that at all. And I think God's going to bless her for that. We're going to get on down to our conclusion, because I really want to get into Unit 5. In conclusion, it's important for us to understand that a man's potential for God lies not, and this is still some fill in your blanks in case you have number 4. It lies not in his abilities, nor his opportunity, but what does it lie in? Anybody want to just throw something out? We've been talking about it. It lies in our humility. Man's potential for God lies not in his ability nor his opportunity, but in his humility before God. We've all heard it said somewhere, look at all this potential. We've got a lot of potential in our church. We've got a lot of good people. We are truly blessed. The only true potential for God and his usefulness is with humble people, though. The only true potential for God is through a humble people. We've all heard someone say, look at all this talent we have. We got to remember, God made a donkey talk. It doesn't take our talent. Remember that. It doesn't take our talent. We don't have to have a talent at all. Now, God gave us talents, and we need to use them for him. We need to use them to bring glory to his name. We do. But it doesn't take our talents that he gave us to do something for him. I got a kick out of that, thinking about God made a donkey talk. That's a good sign right there, that he doesn't actually need a lot in us to work with. We just have to give ourselves to him. There is no potential in us with our ability or our opportunity. Some of us use the excuse that I don't have the abilities of that person, or I don't have the opportunities that God give that person. But all of us can have humility. We don't have to look at someone else's humility to understand that we can have that. We shouldn't be looking at other people's blessings and having envy or jealousy towards those. We shouldn't be doing that to begin with and using that for an excuse. All of us can have the humility it takes to unleash the potential of God. There's no need for discouragement. There is need for humility. And that does it in unit number 4. Unit number 5, if you'd read, you don't read along, but follow along. We'll read through the introduction, we'll read through the objectives, both of them, and then start our lesson. What we have seen so far about the heart of man has not been at all flattering, and it hasn't. God in His Word has painted a picture of man that would naturally lead everyone to despair. But He has also painted a wonderful picture of Christ's remedy for man. So many Christians lead unhappy, unsatisfied, and restless lives because they are either ignorant of or disobedient to God's remedy for indwelling sin. And that's mortification. We need to mortify it. In this unit, we will look at this powerful yet neglected teaching of the Christian walk and warfare. Our knowledge objectives for this lesson here, we're not going to finish it this week, but this lesson here is by the end of this lesson, we should be able to explain the meaning of the 3 steps of mortification in Romans chapter 6. To know, to reckon, and to yield. Those are the 3 steps in the mortification process that we need to understand by the end of lesson 5. And we'll unfold that as we move forward. And how our identification with Christ at the time of salvation makes these steps all possible for every believer. Number 2, recognize the importance of refusing to obey or to feed the flesh. And number 3, understand why God-dependent self-denial is crucial to flesh-free living. Our application objectives is by the end of this lesson, we should be responding to what we have learned by using the teachings of Romans chapter 6 of knowing, reckoning, and yielding in your daily fight against the power of the fleshly nature within you. Number 2, examining your life for areas where you are feeding the flesh and thus sabotaging your effectiveness in resisting the pull of the flesh. Appreciating the Bible's teaching about the importance of self-denial instead of despising or resisting it. And I must say that I'm under conviction this week about this very lesson and how to mortify the flesh. And this is a I say this every week, this is a great lesson. But it just keeps getting better. So at number 1 in your handout, to mortify cross through that word motorcycle. Sorry, Ed. I'm sorry, Ed. Vehicle. To mortify a vehicle, you must. We're going to get into the meaning of that word mortify, but to mortify a vehicle, you must, number 1, let up on the throttle to cut down on the amount of fuel to the engine. To mortify a vehicle, you must apply the brakes to reduce forward motion. If any of you are out and about, by the way, and you run across a large dry erase marker somewhere larger than that, pick that up and I'll pay you for it. I'll pay you double for it. I can't find one. But if you happen to find one, if all of you bring them, it doesn't matter. I just need some and I can't find it. Number 3, disengage the clutch to prohibit the engine's power from driving the rear wheel. I used to be able to draw cars in school, and boy, I was high. Matter of fact, you remember you had notebooks, and you draw little cars on the bottom of each page, and you'd have it racing across. Did you do that? You'd have it racing. You'd flip these pages, and that car would go across, and bam, it would hit something. A lot of times when I was reading through this, actually studying for this lesson, I was thinking about, that's a terrible looking car. That looks more like a piece of a puzzle, doesn't it? Let's start over here. Yeah. Well, we're just going to make a typical car from the 60s or something. Okay. And this guy, he's speeding down the highway. Okay, that's the wind coming off of him. Okay. Before we get into the throttle, the brakes, and the clutch of a car, let's look at the word mortify. The word mortify, today, some of us use it when we're embarrassed. I was at a restaurant the other day, and someone spilt the tea on the table, and it got all over me, made me look like I wet myself. I was so mortified. That's how a lot of us use it. Or this or that. We can use the word mortify another, but that's the first thing that came to mind. But to mortify, it actually means to kill or to die. And in this case, we are killing the forward motion, the force of the forward motion. We're going to kill the force of the forward motion. We're going to use that in the vehicle today. When you're in your vehicle and you're cruising down the highway, how many of you have just been cruising down the highway and la 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 la, and then all of a sudden the traffic ahead of you is stopped, and you got to do some quick thinking here. What's the first thing you do? You hit the brakes, right? Okay. We got to know where these pedals are at. By the way, we are in a manual transmission car in our experience here, okay? Manual transmission car. Some of you are going, what does that mean? Because they're very rare today. But a manual transmission car, if you've never drove one, you know how when you put your car in automatic transmission, you put it in drive and you go. You don't have to have a clutch pedal to push the clutch in and disengage, or actually, let me back up. The clutch, what happens is if the clutch is engaged, it's engaged in the force of the motor at all times when that pedal is not pushed. And when you push in on that pedal, the clutch, it releases the force of the motor from the tires. So you no longer have the force of the motor. Okay, kind of get it? Automatic transmission, it's called the word automatic for a reason. You don't have that clutch down here. It does it automatically by the way of different parts, and we won't get into that. But first I should let up on the throttle though first, right? Push in the brakes, and I could use the clutch to disengage my gears. But all illustrations have their problems, so work with me on this, okay? Basically, if we were to do these three things, let off on the throttle, push in the clutch, and hit the brakes, we're going to mortify the vehicle. Those three things have to happen in kind of a sequence, but they have to happen to stop our vehicle, okay? We're going to use these three mechanical functions to illustrate three spiritual truths taught from Romans 6 that allow you and me, by God's help, to mortify the force or kill the force of the indwelling sin in our lives. Everyone, please turn to Romans 6. We're going to read the entire chapter. It may take just a little bit, but Romans 6 is a very, very powerful, powerful chapter that we ought to be applying in our lives. If we struggle with the flesh, this ought to be one of our everyday readings, just to be honest with you. We'll get to that here in just a minute. Let's read Romans chapter 6. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? Know ye not that so many of us as were baptized unto Jesus Christ were baptized unto his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism unto death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. For he that is dead is freed from sin. Now if we be dead with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him, knowing that Christ, being raised from the dead, dieth no more. Death hath no more dominion over him. For in that he died unto sin once, but in that he liveth unto God. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey it in the lusts thereof. Neither yield your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness? We have a choice. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, ye became the servants of righteousness. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. For when ye were the servants of sin, ye were free from righteousness. What fruit had ye then in those things whereof ye are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now being made free from sin and become servants to God, ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. That is a beautiful, beautiful chapter of how our Christian life ought to be manifested. Romans 8:13 tells us, For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. If ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. Now, that's a very important verse for us to understand, because God, what God's doing here, He's offering us death and life, both. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye live through the Spirit, do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. He's offering us death and life. He says if you choose to live after your flesh, according to the impulse or the pull of that indwelling sin that we talked about a few weeks ago, that indwelling sin that's always with us, you will die. It will destroy you. It will. He says, if you choose to live after your flesh, according to the, I already said it, what I meant is you can find that in Colossians chapter 3. Actually, Colossians chapter 3, verse 1. We'll read verse 1 through 4. You can turn there or you can listen. Verse 1, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affections on things above, not on things of the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth. John Owen, which we've brought his name up several times in this whole study, John Owen wrote about lust. He said, every lust has a depraved habit or disposition that continually inclines in the heart toward evil. Unmortified, it is what is described in Genesis 6:5. Every imagination and the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. The only reason why an unregenerated man is not under the perpetual pursuit of some lust is because he is distracted by so many more of them. The general bent is well recognized, for it is the disposition toward self-pleasing. Men are said to have their hearts set upon evil, so to make provision for the flesh. And that's in Romans 13:14. Now, the primary task of mortification is to weaken this habit of sin so that its power to express itself in violence, frequency, tumult, provocation, and unrest is quelled. Mortification is that work of the Spirit of God as we cooperate with Him that robs sin of its emotionally distracting influences. It kills the force of it. We cannot eliminate it, but the forward force, the power of it, can be mortified. Without mortification, sin darkens the mind, while the lust of the flesh grows like a weed. So that's what John Owen wrote, and that is so. He's spot on. The mortification is the soul's opposition to the fruitless self-life. It's the opposition to the fruitless self-life that is the teaching that we read about in Romans chapter 6. This is the very foundation of mortifying. So we have to know these things. In Romans chapter 6, it was mentioned a few times that know this, or knowing this. Paul's trying to get across to us as a Christian to mortify our flesh. We have to know some things. We can't just drift through life as a Christian. We have to know these things in order to mortify our flesh. Letter A in your handout, we have to know some things. We have to know some things. Back to our vehicle. There's some things we have to know about our vehicle to stop that vehicle, especially in the time of an immediate reaction. Even if we're not, we have to know some things to stop the vehicle anyway. But we really have to know if we are in a situation where we've got to get it stopped and stopped quick. So, what are some things we have to know? Kind of already mentioned them. Silence, crickets. Where are we at? We have to know where the brake pedal's at, for one. We have to know where the throttle's at. That is the gas pedal. Same thing. Throttle, gas pedal. We have to know where the clutch is at. If we're confused about those things, as well as confused about the things that we have to know in Romans chapter 6, if we're confused about them, we're going to have a pretty rough journey in life. Things are going to be unpleasant in life as a Christian. So we have to know some things. If we are going to walk in the Spirit and mortify the flesh, we have to know these things. We cannot stop the force of the flesh in our lives without knowing these things. Just like the vehicle. We cannot stop that vehicle without knowing where these things are at. Okay? Oftentimes, the way we try to deal with sin in our lives is by self-discipline. instead of knowing these things that we can lean on. God gave us the tools. We try to do it by self-discipline. What we do is we say, I'll just stop doing this or that. I'll just stop. I can do it. Or we say, I'll cut it out. I'll cut it out. I'm eating too much. I need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing that. I need to stop eating so much. I'm lusting too much. I just need to control that. I need to get my lust under control. Self-discipline. I'm swearing too much. I'm using examples that I hope that none of us are doing, but nonetheless, it's examples of trying to use our own self-discipline instead of what God has given us in Romans chapter 6. I'm swearing too much, I'll just cut it out. So these examples right here, I'm eating too much, I need to quit that. I'm lusting too much, I've got to get that under control. I'm swearing too much, I just need to cut it out. In reference to our vehicle, what are we doing? We're doing one thing. Guesses? We're hitting the brake pedal. We're hitting the brake pedal. But guess what? That's all we're doing. All the while, we're hitting that brake pedal. We still got our foot on the throttle. I've seen people drive like that, with a foot on the throttle and a foot on the brake. Scares me half to death when I ride with a person like that. Because I use my, that way that doesn't happen. But I know people that do. You're not going to. You may slow that vehicle down, but all the while, that motor is racing, and at the speed you had it on, it could be 70 miles an hour, and you're hitting that brake pedal. You're slowing it down, but there's going to be something that happens very quickly, and the brakes are going to burn out. The brakes are going to fail if that's all you do. We need to know, we need to know some other things to mortify the vehicle, and we need to know some other things to mortify our flesh. We cannot just put the brakes on. We cannot just say, I need to quit that. We cannot just say, I need to get this under control. We can't just say, I got to cut this out. It's not going to happen. We're going to keep doing that, and it's going to get out of control. Been there, done that. I'm guilty. That's where I told you I was under conviction about my past. I should have leaned on Romans chapter 6 a long time ago. And I didn't. I put on the brakes while my foot was still on the throttle. When you find yourself headed down life's highway and you are running into situations involving the flesh, we have to know some other things to mortify the flesh. We've got to know some other things. It doesn't work at all if all you use are the brakes. You got to let off the throttle and you got to push in the clutch pedal. While the engine is running full throttle and the clutch is engaged, we're slowing it down a little bit, but the engine's still providing that forward force. It's a force. When you have your foot on that throttle, it is a force to be reckoned with. Very few things are going to stop that force. I can't remember if I've used this illustration before, but when a train's going down a track at 30 miles an hour or 50 or 60, doesn't matter what speed, it has momentum. There's a lot of momentum in that train, and it's going to take a long time to get that thing stopped. But if a train is rested on the track, and you put a simple piece of wood block in front of that or some kind of barrier, that train's not going to move for a while, no matter what force you put behind it. It's the momentum. We have a lot of momentum with our vehicle. We have a lot of momentum with our flesh. We have to do more than just put on the brake. It's not going to work. Self-discipline alone will not work. Now, the brakes are a part of what we need to know, but it's a very small part compared to the rest of what we need to know. There is a truth we must know, and that truth is called identification with Christ. Identification with Christ. Number 1 in your handout, right underneath that, Romans 6 teaches us that because of Christ's death and resurrection, we have been made free from sin. We no longer have to obey its pull to go our own way. Romans chapter 6 verse 22 says, "But now being made free from sin and becoming servants to God, ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life." We have been made free from sin. That's that clutch. We pushed in the clutch. It's let go. It's let go of that force. Now, is that still going to stop the vehicle quickly? If we still have our foot on the brakes, we still have our motor turning. There's going to be problems there as well. It's going to stop our vehicle, but we're going to burn our motor up pretty soon if we don't do something else. We'll get to that here in a minute. Since our vehicle is a standard transmission, we have a clutch, and when our foot is not on the clutch pedal, our engine force is engaged with the transmission, and because of the clutch is engaged, the force of the engine, it makes our wheels turn. That's the force that makes our wheels make us go down the road when it's engaged. Before we got saved, we had no clutch. We had no clutch. The force of sin always was engaged. We had no way of disobedience to sin. We had no way to stop it before salvation. The sin engine or the flesh engine ran all the time, and the wheels kept turning. There was no clutch to disengage the force from the engine and from the turn of the wheels. The clutch is a way to separate the force of the engine from turning the tires that make our vehicle go down the road. You don't stop your engine every time you stop your car. Now, I had a couple cars like that, by the way. When I came to a stop, my engine stopped a long time ago. And I'd have to sit there at the red light and turn the key and get that thing to start back up. But that's not the way it was purposed. When we come to a stop, we push that clutch pedal in, and it disengages the force of the engine from the wheels, the tires that make us move. All the while we're hitting the brakes coming to a stop. I said before you were saved, we didn't have a clutch to take the force of the sin engine off, but the moment we got saved, God gave us a clutch. God gave us a clutch. Now, the force of the sin is not going away. This is not a perfect world, but we have a clutch now. And we got to use that clutch when we're under the force of flesh. Flesh is eating on us. Before saved, after saved. We have a way out. God provided us a clutch. We don't have to obey the flesh any longer. We've been made free from sin. We read that in Romans. Number 2 in your handout. Paul says in Romans 6:3 that so many of us were baptized unto Jesus Christ, were baptized unto His death. When someone is baptized up here, it illustrates through immersion that it's a picture of death. We died to our sin. Burial and resurrection, just like Jesus Christ. When someone gets baptized, they go under the water testifying that when Christ died, they died too. And when they are raised to walk in newness of life. Okay? They have died to the absolute power of sin because now we have a clutch. We've disengaged the flesh from our lives. But as we move on with our lives, what do? We let off that clutch pedal a little bit. And we become engaged a little bit. We have some flexibility. And we use that flexibility to our no good, by the way. but we still have a clutch. We're not going to make it through to where I wanted to stop at, but we're going to get as far as we can. But we've died to the absolute power of sin. Before this, we had to sin. We had to obey the flesh because we had no separation. We had to obey it. Just think about it. Before I got saved, we did whatever we wanted. Now, we could have been good people. Good people. Some people are known to be just good people. They still had a firm grasp on the flesh. They had to obey the flesh. They had no clutch. When we got saved by God's wonderful grace, we died to sin. We were buried as Christ was. We were raised like Christ was to walk in newness of life. And knowing this, Paul says, remember, he wants us to know something. He wants us to know some things. In verse 6 of Romans, chapter 6, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin, because we've got our clutch now. From that point on, we don't have to be the servant of sin, and we have to know this. It's one of those things, we have to know this. We have to know that we have a clutch now. So keep that in mind. There's no better tool in life's toolbox than when it comes to fighting the flesh. We don't have to obey it anymore. We've got to know that. We don't have to know, or we don't have to obey that fleshly thought in our mind when it comes up, because we're going to have them. Whether it's a lust after a car, or a lust after a garden, or doesn't matter. Or lust of the flesh in a much different way. We don't have to obey that anymore because we have a clutch. And we have a clutch in Jesus Christ our Savior. We don't have to do it. Number 3, before our identification with Christ in this way, we, in these earthly bodies, were required to serve the flesh. We just talked about that. We were required to serve the flesh. Paul tells us, however, that the control of that indwelling sin over us has been destroyed or nullified. The clutch. It's been nullified. The force of our engine has been nullified because God gave us a clutch. We now have a choice. We do not have to obey the flesh. And the bell just rang. Number 4. Let's go ahead and... No, let's leave that out. Number 4. Somebody will mark that. That's where we're going to pick right up next week. And we will just go ahead and dismiss. I appreciate the ears, and boy, thank you, Lord, for giving me some words to say. Everybody kind of get it? You get it? That, to me, mortifying the flesh is so powerful. Oh my goodness. When you compare it to something that everybody knows about, the clutch, the brakes, the throttle,